Hi, Dr. Erden. We hope you got our email about Yana's portion of the project. We just finished filming our 6 questions, and we will be submitting those by tomorrow after we finish editing, and we will hopefully get Yana's into you by Wednesday. Thanks, and enjoy.
Are you ready for it?
So, we're going to be starting with question number 2, which, as you know, was about which teachers we should fire and which ones we should keep. And the first thing I thought through was Hattie's questions. John Hattie, that article we read, where he suggested how we distinguish expert teachers from novice and experienced teachers, and he had a little interview questionnaire for how we should hire teachers and how we know if they're good teachers or not. So he had questions before, like, what do you think about as you planned, like you're planning your lessons and stuff, and I think we should just steal his script and use that when we interview teachers. In addition to that, we should use situational judgment tests, observations by outsiders, and student interactions, and evaluate the content of lessons, and also include student progress, such as VAMs, but limitedly and not as significant as a consideration. And we should also note that good teachers have soft skills and passion for what they do. So how you can spot a good teacher from their characteristics. There's been little systematic research in how we can evaluate teachers' personal characteristics that influence their effectiveness. But Dr. Allison Atterbury from University of Colorado studied 3,000 teachers over their first 5 years of teaching and measured their effectiveness by evaluating student outcomes. And those who are effective tend to maintain their effectiveness even after controlling for external factors, whereas those who were ineffective at the beginning tended to stay ineffective. And Dr. Atterbury claims that this indicated that in addition to academic ability, non-cognitive attributes like empathy and communication are also essential, so the soft skills. Most of the time, she includes empathy, resilience, and adaptability, because we broadly want the same skills for primary and secondary school, but there are some differences in culture. Like Finland wanted more teacher collaboration because they work together more as teachers. And one of the things she asked is, do first impressions matter? And improvement in early career teacher effectiveness. So instead of personality tests, they used scenario-based questions or situational judgment tests because they have a higher validity for predicting job performance because they're harder to fake. And they also included that it would be preferable to not do a face-to-face interview because research indicates that we're prone to biases such as whether the person being interviewed is attractive or not. And when hiring new teachers, personal skills are important because things like organization and communication can be worked on later, but things like empathy are kind of harder to do that with. They're more innate. And she discussed having requirements be similar to military requirements, where you take a test and you go through the physical stuff and all that, but tailored to what teachers need to do. It's not running a course. In John Hattie's review of the factors associated with student achievement in Teachers Make a Difference, What is the Research Evidence? He identified 5 major dimensions of excellent teachers. So can teachers identify essential representations of their subject? Can they guide learning through classroom interactions? Can they monitor learning and provide feedback? Can they attend to effective attributes? And can they influence student outcomes? So through the interview questions, they classified expert teachers, and they found that experts take more time than experienced teachers to build representations, have more understanding of how and why of student success, like what got them there, all that, and are more able to reorganize their problem solving in light of ongoing classroom activities, which basically just means they're adaptable and able to think on the spot of new ways to do things. And they can readily formulate a more extensive range of likely solutions and are more able to check and test out their hypotheses or strategies. So they're more inclined to change the way they do things year after year. Like if something doesn't work with one class, they'll adapt and do something else. and because they have good problem solving and improvising skills, and they're good at taking feedback and giving feedback and adapting, and they're just generally aware of the environment and students and have respect going both ways, and they're passionate about the subject. So when we're assessing these teachers, we should note student test scores, but currently we note test scores in 35 states as a significant or the most significant factor in evaluating teachers, and that shouldn't be true. It should be included but not thought of as more important than other aspects, because in a study or in a subsample of 327 4th and 8th grade math and English teachers from 6 districts, and some teachers well regarded on student surveys, classroom observations by principals, etc., had students with poor tests, and vice versa. So it's not really correlated with what it wants to measure. And the value added models, which is basically what that is, was developed by William Sanders. And it's supposed to be statistical algorithms designed to calculate how much teachers contribute to student learning, controlling for external factors like demographics, but it just isn't correlating with good teachers, because some kids change during the year, move around, and teachers shouldn't be accountable for who left their class or who came into their class late, because if they came the third quarter, then what they did the first 2 quarters wasn't that teacher's responsibility and shouldn't be accounted for by them. And also, some teachers don't even teach subjects evaluated on the test, like all arts programs. For it to work, you would need randomly assigned teachers and students, but in reality, teachers may select the classroom or school that they work in, as well as parents often influence what school or classroom children go to. And this means that students in a teacher's class may not be representative of a general population in growth of achievement, parental support, motivation, study habits, interpersonal dynamics, etc. So statistical analyses are low in validity, and also student performance can be influenced by physical school conditions and resources, school to district policies, etc., which teachers don't have control over, so it's not fair to evaluate them for that. So basically what I would recommend is a similar program to doctors or like the military or law, where most of them have some sort of test at the beginning, like the LSAT, MCAT, military entrance exams, and they go through like a residency program, such as at Santa Clara, there's the Excel or Math-C program, where you do, like, you take classes during your grad school, but you're also in a classroom teaching that classroom, so it's like a full-time of both, so you get really immersed, and you have to try out all the things you get taught, so it's like a baby step kind of thing, and it can help you be a better teacher later on and get that good first impression, because most teachers that are good at the beginning stay good. So that's pretty much what I would suggest.
Okay, yeah, so a more holistic approach.
Yeah, basically.
Nice. So you mentioned observation as being a component of what you should take into account when you're deciding whether or not to fire a teacher. What would you observe?
I would look for the content in the lesson and how the students are reacting to it. Like, if they're just lecturing the whole time, or if they are aware of the needs of the students, and if like they see that they're getting bored, they'll switch to a different activity. So like their problem solving and improvisation skills, so like how they can adapt to the specific classroom, and also how they give feedback to the students, like when they raise their hand and they give an answer, how they respond to that, or if they're grading papers or anything, what they write, all that kind of stuff, and then just how aware of the environment or the students they are. So like if a student is super quiet and like kind of hiding under their hoodie or whatever, like what they do about that, or if someone, like there's a disciplinary issue, how they would address that, like if someone's yelling in the middle of class, what they would do, and just like the general air of respect, like how the students perceive the teacher and how the teacher perceives the students, and just like when they're teaching the lesson or involved with the students, how passionate they are about what they're doing. Just so you can like kind of get the feel of where they're at. Yeah. Okay.
I am doing question 3, which discusses tracking and Piaget and Vygotsky's theories of development and whether or not they would recommend tracking. So tracking, as I'm sure you know, is separating students into different classes or groups based on their academic achievement or cognitive abilities. And Piaget, his theory of cognitive development was that people progress through distinct stages, the sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operation stage, and formal operation stage. And there's no gradual development or like not much overlap between those either. You're either in one stage or the other. So because of that, I think he would recommend tracking, because even though students are the same age typically in their classes, they might have had a lot less experience in like cognitive development, and that would put them in a different stage and make them not ready for certain lessons or something like that. He was also big about cognitive equilibrium and maintaining that, which if you don't track and you teach things that are either too advanced or like too boring for a student, they might have their cognitive equilibrium disrupted. So less cognitively developed students wouldn't be able to like assimilate or accommodate new information at the rate that it's being taught to them because they don't have those skills yet, and that could make them fall behind even further with their peers who are able to assimilate and accommodate, and that could kind of make them less confident in their abilities. So by tracking students, we could give them the opportunity to seek out and construct knowledge that's appropriate to their level of understanding and that corresponds to their developmental stage, rather than giving them curriculum that's general and doesn't necessarily address their needs or the stage that they're in. And Piaget also thought that we learn through exploration and discovery. But if a student feels like they're not smart or like they're learning information that's outside of the degree of their cognitive stage, they probably won't be very likely to attempt to explore and discover because they feel like they will probably just like fail. So I think that's another reason why he would advocate for tracking. Vygotsky, on the other hand, believed that development is gradual and also assisted through both like social and cultural forces, through language, especially inner language, and through assisted learning. So he was really strongly supportive of teachers, and there's no distinct stages. So because of that, I don't think he would recommend tracking, because he believed that through practice and help, like I said, through a teacher, students can reach higher levels of achievement. And tracking would probably also diminish the role of social interaction in students' learning, because by separating them into groups, you're not giving students the ability to interact with other students that might be at a different level than them, but that could get them to like advance up through their zones of proximal development. And so a child's zone of proximal development, that's where like the learning occurs, and when students receive help at the right time, they're able to like learn something new that they might have been on the cusp of learning but couldn't quite get there on their own. And their zone of proximal development could be lower than what they could potentially achieve if they were being tracked into like a lower group than they should have been. So I think that we should track. So I agree with Piaget, although I don't necessarily agree with his theory of distinct like concrete stages. I think that the potential benefits and harms, although they're like kind of unclear, it seems as though tracking is somewhat beneficial, at least to the self-esteem of students, because I think if they aren't tracked and they're just in a class with people of varying degrees of cognitive ability, they're more likely to see other students succeeding and feel worse about themselves. And I also think that if they're not understanding the information, it's kind of like what Willingham said about not giving students appropriately challenging tasks. If you're in a class with just every type of cognitive ability, then the students who are at a higher level of understanding will be bored, and the students who are at a lower level will be struggling to keep up, and then ultimately probably lose interest in school. But I also think that tracking shouldn't be like a hard and fast, you get put into one group and you just stay there forever. It should have the ability to like move up, move down if necessary, and I think that could promote a growth mindset because it gives students something to like strive towards. And there is an argument that moving down could potentially discourage students. And while that could have merit, I think that students would actually, if they truly were struggling in like a higher group than they were, they would probably like to be moved down because being in a difficult class and failing in a difficult class would definitely have an effect on their self-esteem and views of their intelligence, whereas being an appropriate level would make them feel like they have control of their learning and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think a good idea for implementing tracking would be to assess students, give them the results, and then let them pick their level of learning. If students under or overestimate their abilities, teachers and administrators can like work together to move them up or down as they feel necessary. And this also, by letting students pick their level, it gives them autonomy and lets them gauge their own ability so that they can feel comfortable in the classes that they're taking. So I also have question 4, which is about developmental contemplative science and other types of social emotional learning. So developmental contemplative science, or DCS, is basically like a combination of theories about compassion and scientific theories that are used to figure out how we can develop and use compassion in our lives. And it aims to describe the way compassion develops in terms of like biological, social factors, biological and social factors. So like a biological factor, an example of one would be your temperament. An example of a social factor would be like your attachment style. That like could explain the way we develop compassion within each other and like for each other, and how that varies across individuals, across cultures over time. And for the purposes of DCS, compassion includes the following factors: being able to recognize that someone is suffering, seeing suffering as a commonality that all people experience, the ability to not become overwhelmed or incapacitated by someone else's suffering, and a desire and motivation to act when we recognize that someone else is suffering. So, one of the other social emotional learning theories that we learned about was CASTLE, which is a program that's implemented in schools. And it has 5 core competencies that I recognize similarities between CASTLE and DCS. And their 5 core competencies are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So self-awareness kind of has to do with being able to recognize and label your own thoughts and emotions. And that's important because if you can't recognize emotions in yourself, then you probably won't be able to recognize them in other people. And that relates to DCS because there's a big emphasis on like self-care, and if you can't really recognize your own emotions, like you probably can't really care for yourself. That kind of ties into self-management too, because that's there's a big emphasis on emotional regulation and knowing like how to appropriately express your emotions. Again, another aspect of self-care with like coping mechanisms and whatnot. And then social awareness. That deals with recognizing emotions in others and being able to empathize with them, which is what compassion is, so that definitely relates to DCS. And relationship skills, it kind of goes along also with social awareness. It's the ability to establish and maintain healthy relationships, which if you have a certain level of compassion for people, then it'll be easy for you to maintain healthy relationships. And lastly, the responsible decision-making, knowing what actions are appropriate based on situational factors or social norms. That does relate to DCS. However, I think DCS would assert that like as you become immersed in compassion and like being able to express compassion, you kind of would just like know what's appropriate in a situation. You wouldn't have to be necessarily taught it the way CASTLE emphasizes teaching it within a classroom. Mm-hmm. So the differences are that it seems like CASEL was made specifically for classrooms or educators, even though the results will probably translate over into like real life situations. Whereas DCS seems to be more for like general research on how we cultivate compassion in our everyday lives, which again will spill over into like classrooms, but also it's just mainly for everyday life. It also places a big focus on caring for oneself, DCS does, and that's not really emphasized as much in CASEL. It does like talk about identifying your own emotions and being able to manage them, but it doesn't give any instruction on like how to de-stress or like how to really cope with your emotions. So that's really important in DCS because if we're not able to care for ourselves, we can't really take care of others, as Robert or Dr. Roser, cannot pronounce that, sorry, said in our video chat, we can't be running on empty and still trying to like expend for others. So overall difference, there's no emphasis in CASEL on giving care. Necessarily, it's more about respect and recognition of others' feelings. So the differences and similarities to Emotional Intelligence, which is a book by Daniel Coleman. We talked about this briefly in class. Emotional Intelligence was written and emphasized knowing yourself, knowing others, knowing the situation, coping skills, and making good decisions. So very similar to CASEL, knowing yourself kind of deals with knowing and labeling your emotions. So the like self-awareness and self-management also relates to DCS because, again, if you can't know yourself, you can't know others. Knowing others is recognizing and respecting others' feelings. Knowing the situation kind of deals with like the social norms and how to act. And coping skills, I thought it was interesting that they mentioned that because that kind of deals more with the self-care aspect of DCS, which again, CASEL did not emphasize that because coping skills are really important to especially not like becoming so overwhelmed by someone else's suffering that you can't help them anymore. So if you're able to cope with your own emotional stress, you're also likely to be able to cope with somebody else's emotional stress. And then making good decisions, again, is related to knowing the situation and knowing when to act a certain way. So both Emotional Intelligence and CASEL focus part of their approach on knowing how to act in certain situations. Like I said, it seems like DCS is more focused on cultivating the compassion and mindset that would ultimately lead you to act appropriately in the situation rather than coaching like a certain, like this is what you should do in situation A. Because if you are taught that way, then if you get into situation A but it doesn't quite go exactly how you rehearsed it, you probably aren't going to like know what to do and freak out a little bit. And if you were just trained on how to act like compassionately, you would probably be able to handle a situation like that. So the next question is, would I use DCS in a classroom if I were a teacher? And I think in theory it's a really nice approach to engendering compassion in both children and adults. But I don't know like how well it would translate over into a classroom with younger kids especially. I think it's a pretty deep concept, and of course it can be made simpler, but I think mindfulness typically isn't taught very easily to young children, particularly in today's educational system with how like rigid like Common Core is. I think that it would be difficult to implement like self-care practices into curriculum, and I also don't really see those types of compassion cultivating as necessary to be taught in school. I think that like learning self-care and coping mechanisms should probably be taught by like parents or caregivers. And again, there's a lot of overlap in the social and emotional learning in and outside of school, but self-care typically isn't what you learn in school. In school, you learn more like how to interact with other people, whereas like I feel like self-care is more an outside of school type of thing. But I do think that teachers should probably go through like DCS training before they begin teaching, maybe have like refresher courses every so often to ensure that they know how to give, teach, and receive proper care, because it is an emotionally draining job, and it's also important that they impart some knowledge of compassion to their children. So overall, I would use it to train teachers on how to implement social emotional learning in their classrooms, but I would use probably a more classroom specific approach that's like tailored to be implemented in classes like Castle if I were a teacher and using social emotional learning in the classroom.
Okay, so next up we had question number 5, which is, do you think this lesson plan will help students develop compassion? And basically, the lesson plan was having all the students fill out a survey about their interests, like what's your favorite food, what's your favorite hobby, stuff like that, or if they're little, draw pictures, and then organize all these in a binder. And the specific activity it suggests to do with them is like speed play dates, similar to speed dating. So they carry around their survey and they switch every 2 minutes to a different person to get to know each other. And for like some background on like why compassion in classrooms matters, there's evidence that children's social status among peers remains pretty stable across time. And for socially rejected children, this can be a strong predictor for classroom absences, dropout rates, etc. So socially at-risk children are in need of intervention. As in some extreme circumstances, this has been a factor in like school shootings like Columbine. So a short history, social and emotional learning is the process which we learn to recognize and manage emotions, care about others, make decisions, behave ethically and responsibly, develop positive relationships, and avoid negative behavior. So integrating emotional and social learning teaches critical life skills applicable inside and outside of the classroom, and teacher-student relationships are a predictor of student achievement. So this learning facilitates respect, which creates a motivating environment. So I think if utilized in primary education, this could help build students' compassion, as it allows them to learn each other's similarities and differences and begin forming connections to build off of later. However, there should be an added component analyzing those similarities and differences, and that they're okay, and not to disregard someone if they have a different favorite hobby. So it needs to add in the idea of diversity and inclusion to be effective in learning compassion, because from Rossier's research or article, he talked about the different kinds of compassion. So there's different forms, and they're distinguished from each other because they're motivational underpinnings, the developmental origins, the scope of attainment in the population, and spheres of emphatic concern, and yada yada. So the developmental foundations of compassion include felt security and trust, empathy, sympathy, etc., which in time become compassion. So compassion is the motivational desire for all living things to be free from suffering. And there's 5 key elements, which are recognizing suffering, understanding the universality of human suffering, feeling for the person suffering, trying to avoid uncomfortable feelings associated with the emphatic understanding of others' suffering, and the arousal of motivation to act to alleviate suffering. So basically, we don't like when other people suffer, but to help other people, we have to be prepared to help them. And there's different forms of compassion. So there's basic or familial compassion, which you learn from those in your family or closest around you, and it's people who are self-similar to you. So people who believe certain things or do certain things similar to you. But there's also intercultural compassion, which includes those who differ. So it's like social inclusion, which could include the classroom if there's differences between peers. And there's links between empathy and sympathy. So when empathy leads to sympathy, children are more likely to engage in pro-social behavior. But when empathy leads to personal distress, they're less likely to engage in pro-social behavior. So it's like when we talked about the gas tank on the video chat. So you can only give, when you have stuff to give yourself. And when it's too much, you kind of shut down because you can't take on someone else's when you can't handle your own. So children who do not have as well-developed emotional regulation skills are more likely to show distress than pro-social behavior. So if something came up in like an activity, it would be harder for them to process the differences. So schools can promote pro-social motivation through themes of care, direct student engagement in the life of the school, through collaborative projects like having a say in how things are done, and like having a say in school norms and rules, so that they feel like they're involved in what is being asked of them, and like peaceful conflict resolution. So back to the emotional gas tank. The children need to refuel to be able to give. So if they struggle to accept help and compliments, etc., children need to learn how to handle that so that they can be there for other people. But children also need opportunities to learn the skills of extending compassion, as well as practicing receiving another's care to learn compassion. So it needs to be like a give and take. And effective compassion practices structures to the three modes of care, which are receiving from others, caring for oneself, and extending care to others, because they're all interrelated. So one good example with this would be like the buddy bench video we watched. So being able to receive care from others because you're sitting on the bench, taking care of yourself by asking for help from others, and others are extending care to you. Or if someone else was on the bench, you'd be extending care to others. So programs are most likely to be successful when they incorporate all three modes of care and include participants' sense of safety and community, interpersonal connection to others in the program, and experience being seen and heard. So like a balance of you're just like me with you're different from me, so like the students can learn awareness and respect for diversity, especially with younger kids. So I think this lesson could be good, but also needs some work in receiving care from others and for yourself, because it doesn't really get at that. It's more a get to know you thing, but as mentioned, you need a basis to build compassion off of, so it could help for that, especially if they're younger learners, so like early on in their education, and then they can use those topics that they started a conversation with later in the year to go deeper into compassion. Because really it's about the three modes of care, and this lesson doesn't really hit all of them, but it could if it was adapted. Okay, so this is question 6, and it's about applying the principles of motivation to whether tracking is good or not. And I think tracking is a good approach to handling differences in ability. So the motivational principles are competence, belonging, agency, interest and relevance, and purpose. And so some of the claims for pro-tracking are it's harder to teach a class with a wider range of ability because it's often taught to the middle, which hurts both ends of the spectrum because you kind of miss the people that aren't really getting the concept yet, but moving along with the middle of the class, but it also hurts the people that are ahead of the curve because they're not being challenged enough. And it may benefit lower kids to be in a mixed class, but it tends to hurt higher kids because, again, they're not being challenged. And sometimes if you pair the lower kid with the higher kid teaches the lower kid the subject, but they're not learning anything new. There's the big fish in a small pond effect, and then also considerable movement between tracks and between subjects is preferable because it kind of lets people move around to where they need to be. So like if someone's not understanding algebra as well, that doesn't affect their English. And it's also hard to individualize lessons when it's untracked because, again, you have to teach to the middle. But some of the arguments against tracking are students are often put there for motivational or behavioral reasons. So, like if a kid is slacking or not doing great and just being a general nuisance to the teacher, they might be put on the lower track to get them out of the way. And the idea that the other children will learn better. So in the same way that we suspend students so that the other members of the class will learn better in their absence. And it's more likely to be Black or Hispanic students on lower tracks, perpetuating racism and classism. And with time, it is less likely students on lower tracks will move up, because it's just harder for them to catch up the longer they're on the lower track, because they're learning at a different pace and possibly different material. And it's more likely that lower tracks are taught by worse teachers, because the higher tracks tend to have the best teachers for like the AP students and all that. And it stigmatizes students on lower tracks by reducing self-esteem and motivation. However, in a study that we read for one of the assignments, students that were Black or Latino in the lower tracks were doing better or the same as white students, or students in the higher tracks, which says that that's not really true. And to untrack schools, we would need to change teaching style and curriculum. So tracking between classrooms is not better, like within class grouping. So like if we didn't track students but we grouped them by ability in the classroom, that's not better. It'd be, because the idea of tracking is that they would move around anyways, so it would be better if we just tracked the whole thing. Like the 4th grade math video where the students were grouped by ability and it changed depending on the topic and the day what groups everyone was in, so it wasn't like a stigma that you were on a lower track or a higher track. You just switched around to what was appropriate for where you were at. That's how tracking should be and should be played out. And just because it's not played out that way sometimes doesn't mean we should discard the system. It just means we should fix the way it's being implemented. So I also want to note the fixed or growth mindset that you brought up earlier. So for motivation, people want to be challenged, but not challenged to the point that they feel discouraged that they can't do it, but also that it's not too easy. So they need to be appropriately challenged by material, which would help in tracking. So if someone's on a higher track, they'll be challenged more specifically to them than if they were untracked, because often people teach to the middle. Also for peer pressure, if people are tracked, it's cool to be smart in certain cases, which could help motivate students, because one of the reasons that Black and Latino students sometimes don't do well is if their peers see them as acting white by being smart or participating. So if it was seen as cool to be smart, that might motivate them to actually do more and have higher expectations from their teachers and of themselves, which helped Black and Hispanic students in card and Guano study. And also how they attribute their successes. So like if they attribute it to themselves putting in the work, or if they attribute it to whatever class they're in, so like internal versus external circumstances, and whether they're like, I'm just dumb, or I just need to work on this one thing, so like whether they believe that it's stable or unstable. And I feel that tracking would help with that, because it's supposed to move around, and you can see your own progress, and you moving around is an indication of your motivation and how well you're doing. So it's controllable by you. So you don't want to undermine agency or intrinsic motivation by controlling language choice and extrinsic rewards. So attributions for success that are about ability instead of incremental growth, or work that is boring or alienating in classrooms, like you kind of want to include your students and make them feel like they're helping themselves and doing what they need to do. And when tracking is done right, that's what it does. And an example would be Berkeley High, which had tracked and untracked classrooms. So, because one of the big arguments is that tracking perpetuates racism in the classroom, but not tracking, that doesn't change that. So Pedro Negura was a guy that wrote a book about similar issues around the Bay Area, and he worked to close the achievement gap at Berkeley High by dealing with differences between access. So, like, white students registering for classes tend to have their parents' support and knew what they were doing. So they had, like, free scheduling or something before actual being put into registration classes, and they knew how to deal with that, so they would get the good classes, the good teachers, whereas minority students would just be put in whatever classes were left open. So tracking students might actually end up being better because students would be placed where it's appropriate for them. And also, when tracking is taken away, white flight tends to happen. So, like, schools just tend to lose a lot of white kids because they want to be on the higher paths and have all the access to get into college and stuff. So one thing that was noted in the KIP video, or the Knowledge is Power program, is charter schools in areas of poverty, typically with minorities. They had teachers available from 5:50 in the morning to 9:30 p.m. to give time for kids to learn. I'm not advocating that teachers should be required to do that, but also they noted that teachers opted in to do this. So they chose to be available for that time, and that was interesting because it gives the children time to learn what they need to learn so that they can move up and be where they want to be. So it lets them feel competent and own what they're doing because they see how much time they put in, they see the work, they see what comes out of it. And that's what tracking is meant to do. And then also there's the theory of multiple intelligences, which learning styles are trash, but the theory of multiple intelligences is like a kid might be good at music, but kind of terrible at math. And if they were tracked, they could be really high in music and kind of lower at math and be where they are developmentally at for each subject without it being a big deal. Because one of the arguments is that people on the lower track will feel bad, but if that's where they need to be to get better, then it's only going to help them. Because if they're in an untracked classroom, they're going to feel dumb anyways when other kids see that they didn't do as well on stuff, and they're going to feel it. So they might as well feel smart in a smaller pond, like the big fish in a small pond effect. So tracking is a good approach because it really hits all the principles of motivation and letting students own their experience and give purpose to what they're doing on their terms. And it's kind of up to them how they use their interest. Like if they're interested in a subject, they might excel further. If they're not, they might not, and that's okay because people are better at different things, and that's what makes people people. So yeah.
Okay, so last question 9. It's about classroom management, and he wanted us to talk about the different approaches that we did in class, or pick one that I prefer, and then apply Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development to it. So the approach that I prefer is restorative justice, which was the one that they talked about in the podcast, and they used that at the Lions School. And it's used in prisons, but they applied it to the school as well. And it's when you talk through a problem, so if you have like a behavioral issue, the student would talk through what they did, the consequences of their actions, and discuss what can be done about it rather than just being like given a really swift, harsh punishment that sometimes is bigger than the action that was committed, like how one of the guests on the podcast was talking about how he got suspended for like celebrating his math grade just because he talked out of turn. And I think that restorative justice would be really good because it promotes feelings of autonomy in students. It gives them the ability to kind of like not necessarily like make their own fate or like say that I think I should receive this punishment for this thing that I did, but it does give them the ability to like problem solve and have at least a bit of a say in what they think should be going on with their terms of like punishment. And this type of like shared decision making, it kind of engenders feelings of mutual respect between teachers and students. Whereas like a system like a zero tolerance policy, it could create an us versus them mentality between the students and the teachers that just makes the students angry, especially when teachers don't really give any explanation for why they're giving punishments. And the students could just come to see the teachers as like harsh authority figures that aren't really there to support them. They just want them to like fail basically by giving them such harsh punishments. And zero tolerance policies follow the idea that students should comply, but according to social psychology, when the authority figure is gone, they'll most likely revert to their old behaviors. So what I was thinking of when I thought of this point was when they were walking in line to go somewhere at the one place that uses a zero tolerance policy, and everybody was really quiet except one student talked out of turn for like a second, and then he was given a demerit. But as soon as there's no authority figure present, who knows if that like level of silence would stay the same. The students might just go crazy as soon as there's nobody around to supervise them. So in application to Vygotsky, he said that humans develop best through social interaction, and I think that restorative justice really promotes that because it's like a coming together of minds between students and teachers, and then other students, administrators too. So they'll be able to come together and think through problems and really come up with solutions to problems of behavior. And teachers helping students through restorative justice talks would also provide like assisted learning, which was another concept that Vygotsky really advocated for because that's how he thought that people would like scaffold up through their zones of proximal development. So it would allow students to scaffold up further and develop further both in and outside of the classroom because this type of restorative justice where people talk through problems is really applicable to real life too, even though in the podcast they talked about a situation, unfortunately, where that was not so much applicable. It would help, I think, overall in the grand scheme of things, also kind of helps them to like think about compassion and develop that social emotional learning. And adult-child interactions in general are essential to a child like being able to develop because the adult can kind of like model how you should be acting and teach the child how to deal with certain situations. So that teacher-student relationship is a perfect example of the adult-child interaction. And using restorative justice could also help the development of a child's inner speech, which Vygotsky also emphasized the importance of language, especially inner speech, like talking to yourself and talking through things, problems. So it would be more likely to enforce that inner speech than a zero tolerance system because that doesn't really require students to reflect on their actions at all. They just know like, oh, if I do this, then this happens. So I either will do this again if I say don't mind being suspended because I can go home and like play video games. Whereas in a restorative justice system, if they say, well, if I do this, then it could have this consequence and this consequence and this consequence, and it could make this person feel this way, so on and so forth. So for restorative justice to be effective, I think that one thing that's really important to remember or understand is that development isn't the same for everyone. Every kid develops at a different pace. It's gradual. So everybody is going to need different help, like more, say, assisted learning in talking through their restorative justice. So it can't just be like, oh, well, the problem was between these 3 students, so these 3 students need to talk it out. There needs to be an authority figure present who can like help them facilitate that discussion. And it's also important to use an appropriate type of restorative justice depending on the age and developmental level that you're dealing with. So like having kindergartners sit down and have a really philosophical talk about like the ethicality of their actions probably wouldn't be the most effective way to implement restorative justice at this level. And it's also important to understand that restorative justice includes a component of compassion. So like depending again on like the age of the child, they might not have really understood like that theory of mind type concept that like, oh, other people have feelings. So if they, this mainly is in younger kids, but if they haven't really truly developed that yet, then it's going to be a lot harder for them to see like the consequences of their actions. So facilitating that first would also be important. So building that foundation of like, oh, well, other people also have emotions and feel things and are affected by the way that you do things would make it perfect for them to incorporate this restorative justice into their classrooms.